Welcome, everyone. Thank you for making time to participate in this event. My name is Joel Wallman, and I'm the Director of Research at the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. For those who might not be familiar with our foundation, HFG sponsors and disseminates research on violence, what causes it and what works to prevent or reduce it. And by violence, we mean physical violence in all of its forms and scales, from the interpersonal to the international. We expect those who receive our research grants to publish their work in scholarly venues, but we also encourage them to convey their findings to a broader public. And we take it as part of the Foundation's mission to publicize knowledge about the causes and reduction of violence. We do this through our publications and through public fora such as this, our Knowledge Against Violence speaker series. Today's presentation grows out of the superb contribution to our Research and Policy in Brief series that was written by our speakers, Diana Chigas and Cheyanne Scharbatke-Church. In Fueling the Fires, How Corruption and Conflict Keep Each Other Burning, which is available on our website, they provide what is surely the best available short-form treatment of the relationship between corruption and violent conflict. We invited them to distill down the wisdom of this work in a public forum, and here they are. Cheyanne Scharbatke-Church is the Executive Director of Besa Global, a Canadian think tank, and co-director of its Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy program, which provides corruption analysis and designs programs that support peace building and anti-corruption efforts in fragile and conflict-affected states. They currently work in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, always with local partners. Cheyanne has extensive experience in peace building, governance, and anti-corruption work around the world, including in the Balkans, West Africa, and East Africa. She has pioneered the application of systems thinking to the analysis of corruption and the role of social norms in driving corruption. Diana Chigas is the co-director of the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy program at Besa Global. She is also professor of the practice of international negotiation and conflict resolution at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Her current research focuses on how social, gender, and faith norms influence corruption and anti-corruption in conflict-affected settings. She has worked with governmental, non-governmental, and intergovernmental partners across Africa, Europe, and the US to support corruption analysis and program design. Now, our presenters will begin with a brief introduction to their topic, and then in the tag team style of professional wrestling, we'll alternate in presenting their research in 3 sections. At the end of each section, there will be about 5 minutes for questions from our audience on what has just been discussed. And then at the end of their presentation, about an hour from now, there should be a good deal of time left in this 90-minute session for more questions and responses. We encourage all of you in the audience to submit your questions and thoughts in the Q&A section of Zoom or in the comments section. Please note, finally, that this discussion will be recorded and it will be published on our website and our YouTube channel. Now, Cheyanne and Diana, please unmute yourselves, turn on your videos as needed, depending upon who's speaking, and take the stage.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joel, for that really kind introduction. And I was an enormous fan of wrestling, the Wrestling Federation as a kid. So really appreciate that form of introduction. Um, Thank you to the foundation for inviting us to write this paper, and Joel for giving us such excellent feedback, and to Halima for organizing this webinar. We always really relish the opportunity to get to actually talk with smart, intelligent people such as yourselves who've joined this conversation today. So thank you very much. And to everyone online, welcome and thank you for your time. And we really look forward to really digging deeper into whatever aspect of the presentation resonates most for you. So, as Jill described, I lead a Canadian organization called Besa Global, and one of our work streams looks at the intersection of endemic corruption, organized crime, and violent conflict. And we think this is such a critical nexus to focus on because of the disconnect between the structure of the problem and the structure of the response community. And then, of course, all the associated implications for the effectiveness of trying to create change in these environments. Now, the problem, conflict, corruption, and crime nexus, that problem is an integrated, multivariable, complex system. Well, the response community, be it the academic community, the policy, or implementation community, is typically fairly simple and highly siloed. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we have separate organizations. We have different and sometimes even competing frameworks, analytic lenses, implementing approaches, and even the data that we rely on is often different between the different sectors. We even have different international obligations and treaties. And for instance, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption deals with corruption versus the one that deals with organized crime. And those silos absolutely overlap within the academic world. We have separate conferences, academic journals, and even research institutes. And this disconnect between this highly integrated problem and yet these siloed communities between crime, corruption, and conflict, it matters because if we are seeking positive peace in the places that we work, then we have to not just address the conflict, but we also have to address the corruption dynamics. Moreover, when we don't address the corruption dynamics, we are at best setting these states up for negative peace, but at worst, if we don't address the corruption dynamics, we are making them highly vulnerable to state capture. So that's why we think it really matters. Now, our plan is to break the webinar into 3 distinct phases, as Joel described. I'll start off with a few core concepts and then hand it over to Diana to dive into the first section on how corruption fuels conflict. As Joel said, we're going to have a couple different opportunities to discuss, and we really look forward to that. So, couple core concepts. Corruption. The most widely used definition of corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Now, even though it's the most widely used, it is not 100% accepted. And in fact, the United Nations Conventions Against Corruption opted to not include a definition and instead go through a typology of types of corruption because they couldn't land on a universally agreed definition. Nonetheless, this one is the most accepted, and I want to flag a few quick things. Underlining the notion that abuse is not simply things that are illegal. These are misuses or violations. So it takes us outside of the strict legal versus illegal zone. Entrusted power. Entrusted power is not solely regulated to official roles. Entrusted power can sit within a faith group, it can sit within a traditional leadership structure, it can sit within a community. So entrusted power transcends private, public, communal, all sorts of different roles. Private gain. I want to break 2 pieces down here. It's common for people to think of private as individual, that the gain from corruption must be at some sort of individual benefit. And that can happen, absolutely. But it's not simply individual. It can be family, it can be clan, community, church, office, political party. The private does not necessarily equate to one individual person. And it absolutely does not equate only to money. So private gain can be multifaceted, and the gains can be fiscal, but it also can be access to opportunities, incentives, sexual, there can be a whole variety of different gains. Sometimes people find it easier to break corruption down into the different types, bribery, nepotism, sexual corruption, etc. And we find it helpful because it forces the conversation to get a little more concrete and accurate. Now, abuse of entrusted power for private gain is the most widely used definition, but just talking about the definition itself doesn't fully encapsulate some of the assumptions that people bring to the interpretation of the idea of what is corruption. So the dominant paradigm, what we often call the classical understanding, sees corruption, well, the acts of corruption as done by individualized bad apples. So one person, maybe two or three, acting alone. And the behavior is not expected. It's not common. So the behavior, the act of corruption is seen as deviant or out of the ordinary. It's seen as wrong, and really importantly, the corrupt behavior is generally seen as quite shameful. Now, with that understanding of corruption, then the classic response fits. You detect the bad apple, you investigate to prove that they have done a corrupt act, and then you sanction them for wrongdoing. Now, there's nothing wrong with this understanding, except for the fact that it isn't typically how corruption works in many parts of the world. And it certainly isn't how corruption works in places of conflict. Corruption in places of conflict are typically endemic, and so you'll see this sometimes talked about as systemic corruption. We prefer the phrase endemic corruption. And people often think when they hear of endemic corruption that that means corruption's widespread. And that's totally true. In places of endemic corruption, the amount of corruption is very widespread. It occurs at all levels and across all sectors. But it's far more than that. Endemic corruption is typically networked, and we often think of it to ourselves as it's a team effort, in the sense that it's embedded in and perpetrated by networks of people. It's like a cooperative venture in order to figure out how best to manipulate the system for personal gain. It's very institutionalized and organized, and so it's not one-off. It's not this individual one-off opportunistic transaction. It's actually a set of very anticipatable, regularized actions. And it's so regularized that there are a set of informal rules that guide how one is supposed to behave to acquire illicit wealth and power. And the final sort of differentiating variable in terms of endemic corruption is that, like many systems, for those of you who are familiar with systems analysis, the system itself has a purpose, or it serves a function. It's not just this individual self-interest. Now, that function may not be socially positive, like a group manipulating the system to retain power, but we have to recognize that it is serving a function, and because of that, systems fight back. And this becomes very important when we think about how to respond, because if the system will fight back, we have to be ready to be nimble and agile. This idea of endemic corruption was really eloquently summed up by an Afghan official several years ago. In speaking with a US embassy official, he reportedly described corruption as such, quote, "Corruption is not just a problem for the system of governance in Afghanistan. It is the system of governance in Afghanistan." Endemic corruption in conflict contexts are always highly resilient and adaptive, and they're key features of the political and social economy. And so when we keep that in mind, it means that we can't deal with it by arresting people and putting them in jail. In other words, the classic detect, investigate, and sanction as our only approach. While some of that work might be necessary, if that's the approach that we take, it won't be sufficient. Okay, I hope that's enough grounding. And if people already knew that, I apologize. We're going to move on. I'll hand it to Diana to dive into how corruption fuels conflict. And I'll just remind you, as things come up as questions or considerations, please do pop them into the chat. Diana?
Great. Thanks, Cheyanne. And great to see everybody here. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A conversation about this as well. So as Cheyanne said, within a context of endemic corruption, where corruption is very much a part of governance and a part of the political, economic, and social system, we found very broadly three main ways that corruption can act as a driver of conflict or can fuel conflict. And the first, as you can see here, is very direct. It's a source of financing for violent conflict, especially for non-state armed actors who effectively need to take part in illicit economies in order to generate the funds they need to fight. So if you think about the FARC in Colombia, the Taliban in Afghanistan, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, they have all sustained themselves to a large extent through illicit drug trade or other kinds of illicit economic activities. In places like Democratic Republic of Congo, where we've worked quite a bit, which has sort of enormous natural and mineral resources, extracting, selling, taxing these resources also serves as a significant source of income, along with revenues raised from protection rackets and forcible collection of what we call taxes at roadblocks along key transportation, trade, and humanitarian routes. I just note that it's not just the non-state actors who engage in these and who use illicit activities and corruption to get money for their war effort, so to speak, but the governments rely on them too. So the Syrian government during the war, for example, was greatly involved in the Captagon drug trade. Once sanctions had dried up any other source of legitimate funding they could get, and the war had destroyed the economy, they needed money to sustain themselves, to sustain their patronage networks, and to sustain the people who were fighting on their behalf. So had to resort to illicit means. In DRC, of those roadblocks where taxes are collected, 71% of them are run by the military. And the government tolerates that and perhaps even encourages it because it ensures that they have people who are still willing to fight the war. So that's a first direct moon. A second means that we have seen, which I think is a fairly big one, is that it exacerbates often existing inequalities and grievances that themselves drive conflict. And sometimes corruption can directly be a source of grievance. Think about the recent Gen Z uprisings that have toppled the governments in Nepal, Bangladesh, or Madagascar. Youth who are aggrieved by political elites that they see living lives of luxury because of their capture of the state and their diversion of public funds, while everybody else lives in poverty, doesn't have a future, job opportunities, services like health, electricity, education are neglected and bad if non-existent. That generates resentment, and you could see that it generated even sort of enough energy for mobilization. But that isn't the only way that corruption exacerbates these inequalities or generates grievances. It often does it through indirect means. In other words, it exacerbates inequalities and grievances that already exist, because effectively corruption is a way that one group is able to benefit, whether it's through clientelism, patronage, and jobs, or procurement and sort of amass money that often happens at the expense of another group. And it, of course, it can be used and often is used quite explicitly to go after, discriminate against, exclude, or marginalized government or a group's political opponents. So when you have that kind of dynamic, the inequalities that are generated and exacerbated, when those overlap with group identities, whether it's political versus youth, ethnic groups, religious groups, et cetera, it can become explosive, especially when the corruption is being seen as unfairly giving advantage to the other sort of adversarial group. I'll give you just a small example from a place that we've worked in, Central African Republic, but we've seen it in Sri Lanka and other places where minority populations, it's Muslims in Khar, Tamils in Sri Lanka, they've complained bitterly that they were targeted more for bribes than members of the majority group. They were asked and required to pay far more and give far more in any corrupt transaction. And then they were treated more harshly if they were caught. So you can see that this generated an enormous amount of resentment that was layered on to existing resentments about other kinds of exclusion or marginalization or grievances. And it's not necessarily just the corruption that is the source of grievance. It's really the injustice and the inequality. There's been some research in Kenya that has shown that the 2007 elections, where there was enormous violence, where violence broke out, was due in part to ethnic groups who had historically been excluded from power, believing that the election was manipulated, and they had been deprived of, and I use a quote because many people have said it, their time to eat. In other words, they had been denied access to resource that they thought rightly that it was their turn to have access to, as like the majority population. So it's the sense of injustice that really drives those sort of conflictual relations. And that's, of course, reinforced when the abusers, when the corrupt are able to buy impunity for their corrupt acts, rig the justice system, rig election systems to avoid accountability. And certainly, I think Cheyanne would probably agree, in my peace-building career, impunity, as I was doing conflict analyses, impunity came up over and over again across many different contexts as a very significant driver for many people and a significant grievance for many people in conflict. So I'll go through a third one, which is around undermining state legitimacy and capacity. And that should not be surprising. Think about hospitals with no supplies and lack of staff, schools with ghost teachers and shoddy buildings, unqualified civil servants who have been hired through patronage. All of these things undermine the state's capacity to perform its function because that has been gutted by the corruption. And I'd note that a key function, not the only one, that is compromised is, of course, the ability of the state to provide effective mechanisms for resolving and managing conflict. And again, sort of a bit like the sort of exacerbating inequalities and grievances, it's not necessarily the lack of capacity that's the direct issue and direct driver of conflict, but it happens indirectly for a couple of reasons. One is that the government does often lose legitimacy and trust of the people, and this makes people more vulnerable to recruitment by extremist groups or rebels who can claim to say, look how bad your government is. We will provide services. We will take care of you. We will have better governance. That was a huge issue in Afghanistan. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, when they conducted surveys in 2010 to 2012, and they found in those surveys of Afghans, ordinary Afghans, that corruption was one of the top 3 reasons those who chose to support the Taliban instead of the government did so. So a big issue. I'll say one last thing before we go to a little bit of Q&A, to note that corruption, because it's so often associated with decay, immorality, and evil, can really deepen negative stereotypes of the other in conflict. And of course, it's often used deliberately by politicians to do just that. And we can think in our own country, in the United States, for those of us who are in the United States, they drain the swamp, crooked Hillary, accusations of corruption that are used to sort of defame and to delegitimize members of the opposition. Not unique to the United States by any means, but what it does is it then deepens already negative stereotypes of the other side as corrupt and bad, and of course then becomes very much a part of the conflict rhetoric and conflict language. So those are 3, maybe 3.5 reasons. There are many things underneath, so I'm at a very general level and sort of welcome questions and comments from all of you. But I think I'll end there and turn it to Joel for a little bit of question and answer before we go to the next section.
Thank you for that, Diana. As befits a discussion of corruption, I'm going to exploit my position as the master of ceremonies to ask a first question. And that is, Well, it's fairly easy to understand how corruption can cause or accelerate conflict, as you've just detailed quite clearly. It is not quite as obvious, although it's understandable on reflection, how conflict can facilitate corruption. And I know will be this dynamic will be discussed in the next section. But what is least obvious is, at least on first thought, is how corruption can inhibit violence, which means that efforts to reduce corruption might, contrary to intuition, exacerbate violence. I raise this because one of the contributions of your research is detailing the mechanisms through which corruption can indeed limit violence, at least in the short run. So I wondered if you could talk about that briefly.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's both intuitive and counterintuitive, but absolutely, there is evidence that in the short term that you can, I think people have used the term buy the peace. So in a peace deal, and you can look at Bosnia, you can look at Liberia, you can look at Tajikistan, many, I won't go into the number. If you divide up the spoils, you allocate different ministries to different parties, and they can sort of take advantage of whatever resources and patronage and do that. If you tolerate corruption, as long as the opportunities are distributed across the conflict parties, it can help in stopping immediate violence. People have fewer incentives to go back to war, and certainly some of the spoilers it may be useful for bringing in potential spoilers into the thing. And so we'll talk about it a little bit later, that this is true, but it does have some long-term consequences that one also then has to really figure out how to deal with, that are pretty negative, and we haven't quite gotten to figure out what those trade-offs are and how to manage them.
Thank you for that. There are a couple of questions from the audience. One is, do you think that corruption can be weaponized in international conflict, including conflict outside of armed conflict, so short of armed conflict? Thoughts on that?
Diana, I'll lead and then hand it back to you. That's such an excellent question, and it makes me think of a presentation that I recently attended given by one of the anti-corruption professionals out of the Ukraine. And she said very pointedly, she said, the war did not start with the first missile. It started with strategic corruption instrumentalized by Russia against Ukraine. And she said it in the context of the importance of having robust anti-corruption infrastructure within a country, because it is actually a form of security and defense from an international aggression that is in the form of corruption versus a classic form of violence. Diana, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that, and you could see very easily, and it certainly has happened in Ukraine. It's been looked at in Europe, in the United States, how the use of strategic corruption has been used to help to start to polarize societies and develop different interests around certain policies and divide people. So we didn't address it specifically in our brief, but it's a huge issue that needs to be included in part of it as we think about that relationship between corruption and conflict.
I have another. The question is, do you organize a scale of corruption by country, by which I think the questioner means, do there exist accepted rankings of countries on a scale from least to most corrupt? Is that clear?
I'm not sure I got it 100%. Would you mind restating it, Joel?
Yeah. Are there organizations that rank countries in terms of the extent of corruption? Do you use such scales? And are they considered, defensible rankings?
Well, there's a whole number of different indexes out there. The most famous, if you will, the most well-known one is the Corruption Perception Index, which was started by the Transparency International Berlin, and it does rank countries. It is a perceptions-based index, so they have a very complicated methodology of bringing together existing perception surveys and amalgamating them into a ranking. It gets widely misunderstood in terms of when countries move up and down that ranking, because it really isn't meant to be able to assess over time. There's also GI Talk, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, has a global crime index. There's also a peace index. So there's a whole number there's a peace index that has some corruption indicators within it. So there's a whole number of them, none of which are perfect because it's a complex set of variables that they're trying to boil down into a very simple singular number. Diana?
And I just add to that, as we're thinking about the relationship with conflict, I mean, obviously it's very helpful to be able to, and there's a lot of effort now going into how do you actually measure corruption beyond looking at perceptions, which I think is really important because it's important to know where it is, how much it is, what's happening, et cetera. And a lot of effort is going into that, actually much more than saying sort of what are the drivers of the corruption and how does that actually interact with conflict? Because big scale doesn't necessarily mean big conflict impact either. So I think one needs to look at both of them, and the scale is not necessarily determinative of the kind of influence that it may have on conflict dynamics.
Excellent answers. We have questions pouring in now, and we may come back to some of those at the end of the day, because we need to move on now to hear from Cheyanne about the causal arrow pointing in the other direction. That is to say, how conflict exacerbates corruption. So please weigh in, Cheyanne.
Super. Right. So Diana did an excellent job talking about how corruption drives conflict. And now we have to think about, all right, well, how does conflict exacerbate or fuel or enable corruption? And there's really two main ways. The first is that conflict creates opportunities for corruption. And the second is that conflict entrenches illicit wealth into state institutions. And I'm going to unpack both of those a little bit. If we think of the first one, how conflict creates greater opportunities for corruption, we see it in three main ways. First, and this is no surprise, that violent conflict weakens state institutions. And when we say weakened, we mean it in really concrete, practical ways. Conflict diminishes the amount of money in the budget that can be allocated to basic services and the running of government. Conflict removes competent staff, either because they're working on the conflict issues, or they're fighting, or they've fled the country. So you have less competent staff. It destroys the infrastructure, and particularly the infrastructure that provides basic services throughout the country. It ends up ruining equipment, and I can go on, but conflict weakens state institutions. That not only means governments cannot provide services, it also means that they're not able to perform classic good management processes. Think of things like supervisor sign-offs, getting multiple quotes, basic oversight efforts, widespread recruitment to fill positions. All of these things become harder to follow. Because of that, you're increase in the opportunity for corruption. And over time, it's no longer just an opportunity, it becomes a new habitual way of operating. Let me give you a quick example from Iraq. A year after the establishment of the Coalition Provisional Authority, public institutions were struggling to know how many employees they had. They forget it trying to keep track of state resources or hosting robust hiring and contracting practices. Fast forward 15 years to 2019. Iraqi ministers were still reporting that it was the political blocs within their country that were processing contracts without any ability for those ministers to provide real oversight. And so these long-lasting consequences of weakened state institutions become habitual corrupt practices. And before we move on to the next one, it's really important when we're talking about conflict and corruption to really also not forget the criminal justice sector. So your police, courts, and corrections, because they're not immune to being weakened by corruption. And they're certainly not immune to being weakened by conflict. And when you weaken these critical sectors, then it becomes very difficult to detect, investigate, and sanction. But it's not just that. It makes this sector become open for the ability to buy impunity. And so the corrupt opportunity opens up due to the conflict, and therefore your criminal justice sector is for sale. And that obviously feeds into greater impunity for those actors who are not following the rule of law within that country. The second way that conflict exacerbates or creates greater opportunity for corruption is that it diminishes the key pillars of accountability, the parliament, civil society, media, and all of that. Without the key pillars of accountability, you increase the opportunity for corruption. Finally, the physical threat of violence and insecurity that comes with living through a conflict, coupled with the concurrent weakening of institutions where they're not providing basic services around health, education, water, sanitation, creates a context of very real and severe uncertainty and scarcity for citizens. And so when you have uncertainty and scarcity, particularly over the longer term, they come together and act as incentives for corruption, because the corruption becomes a coping mechanism for dealing with the environment in which they're in. It's corrupt networks, it's corrupt transactions that might give you access to food, might give you access to shelter, safety, or maybe the opportunity for a job. And so corruption becomes incentivized because it's a very real means to an end when there aren't very many other means at all. So conflict, it really is the water and the sun and the fertilizer behind corruption. The second main way that conflict exacerbates corruption is by entrenching the illicit economies and elevating those actors that are dependent on illicit wealth into official positions, and in particular into political office. But I want to break down that a little bit more. So war fuels the emergence of a combat economy, and that's where the state participates in illegal activities to generate the resources they need to fight the war, so to finance the military effort. And this can be anything from drug smuggling to weapon smuggling to sanction busting, you name it. The state needs money, and they need money to fight the war, and so you get a combat economy. The thing is, the combat economy does not end when the war ends, because all of the networks, the actors, the knowledge, the systems, the expertise, etc., they all still exist. So too do all the incentives around the need to access wealth. So just because the war ends, those things do not end. So it makes perfect sense that these efforts continue post-war, and they morph into what Goodhand calls the shadow economy. So let's take the Balkans just for a quick sec for an example. Before the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia, 40% of the heroin destined for Western Europe transited through Kosovo and Macedonia. In the first 5 years after the war in Kosovo ended, that went from 40% to 80%. So post-war shadow economies are very embedded, very entrenched, which makes them very hard to combat. And there's two particular points I want to flag around why they are so hard to combat. And the first is because post-war politicians who have obtained their wealth or some of their wealth through participation in the combat economy during the war means that they're often still embedded in the shadow economy in the post-war period. So their role may have changed. They may now be an official in the government or an elected official. So their role has changed post-war, but their networks, which dictates their access, obligations, and sources of revenue, sources of resources, often do not automatically change. So what we have in a post-war situation very commonly is post-war politicians beholden to what are now organized criminal groups. They were militias during the war, but they've become organized criminal groups. So these post-war politicians have beholden to organized criminal groups who are very happy to demand the manipulation of the state to facilitate their criminal efforts. They don't want to take over the state, they just want the state to stay out of their business. And the second reason that post-war shadow economies are really hard to combat is because many vulnerable people rely on the shadow economy for their livelihood. Think of artisanal miners, informal laborers, people who smuggle things across borders. All of these people have their livelihood embedded into the shadow economy. And so if you go hard after the shadow economy, it's extremely difficult to tackle without doing harm to this group. I'll give you a quick example and then we can move on. Because Guatemala offers just an excellent example of embedding politicians into organized criminal networks in the post-war environment. The Guatemalan Commission Against Impunity, which was set up after the war, was a very interesting hybrid national international commission. And its mandate was to pursue illegal security groups and organizations so that they could combat impunity. The extent of the political, government, and economic actors embedded into organized criminal networks was so far beyond what the investigators had even predicted that they themselves were astonished. And I think that's quite telling if the people who are the experts in this didn't even have a sense of just how deeply embedded the licit and the illicit actors were with each other. So, quick sum. Conflict hurts the state ability to function, and it is in those weaknesses where corruption really flourishes. And simultaneously, conflict changes the nature of the economy, where we have an embedding of illicit actors and processes that do not go away when the fighting ends. So you no longer have, you do not revert back to a rule of law economy just because the war has ended. And with that, I'll pause and see if Joel wants to press me on anything or if we should move on.
I had a great summary of that discussion ready, but you've undercut me by presenting an even better summary than I had in mind. And I'll just ask you this: what happens if those who are working on ending conflict or building peace in a post-conflict setting are ignorant of these mechanisms, by which violent conflict exacerbates corruption?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and that what we talked about earlier around the siloing of the anti-corruption, the peace building, and the crime fields makes it for that people often just stay in their silos, and I think it's a real problem because, well, most of the people on this call, I'm sure, were reasonably aware of how conflict can exacerbate corruption. The thing is that the peace building response and the responses themselves have to also reflect this connectivity because the two phenomena are actually interrelated as a vicious cycle. And I'll just quickly pull up a slide if I can share again. So in systems thinking, if you're familiar with that, to be effective on corruption or to be effective on combating conflict, you have to be responsive to the other because it's a vicious cycle. They are part and parcel of the same dynamic. And in fact, this image that I'm showing you, it's actually oversimplifies things, because conflict and corruption interact as a complex adaptive system, not just a singular cycle, but one that has so many more variables to it. So I did make a quick slide of the system of corruption in Central African Republic while the militias were still attacking in Bangui. And I don't expect you to be able to read it, and I'm not going to dive into it. My sole purpose of showing this is to just show the degree of variable factors that are all fueling this complex adaptive system. And so anytime we try and intervene on a system like this, it will adapt and respond to these interventions. And so even if you are wanting to only work on the violent conflict, you are intervening into this multifaceted system, which is then going to adapt and respond. And that could be in ways of moving from conflict means more into corrupt means. And so our responses need to be adapted to the nature of the problem, not necessarily the nature of the silos that we've created. I could go way more into systems, but I won't, because I think that's probably the topic of a different webinar.
Super. Could you leave that slide up? I hadn't quite finished reading it.
Yeah.
There are a number of great questions coming in now. Let me pose this to you. To what extent do you think corruption can become more complex when the military is webbed in it?
Diana, shall I do a kick and then you say something more erudite? Okay. I think the corruption becomes significantly more complex let me take it back. I think the conflict becomes significantly more complex when the military becomes embedded in the corruption, because they are then generally profiting through the corruption, and so it's not in their interest to stop the war. We saw this fairly extensively in West Africa with some of the Nigerian peacekeepers in the ECOWAS force in Sierra Leone, where they were profiteering, selling weapons, smuggling drugs, and then they would act differently against each side in the conflict, pending how the war was going, but not in order to minimize the violence in Sierra Leone, but to keep it ticking along. So I think the conflict actually becomes more complex when the military becomes more integrated with corruption. I hope that made sense. Diana?
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Since Ukraine was brought up and strategic corruption, I think one of the things as we look at the way corruption can affect the military, not to say that Ukraine is not a corrupt place, but they had been taking, and there's been some research that they had been making some efforts to reduce corruption in the defense sector. And so people were attributing partly their ability to be more resilient to the fact that they had started to deal with the corruption, because the corruption can weaken the military dramatically and weaken your security forces and their ability to defend you. I think the other piece, as we see in Nigeria continuously, and I know we have some Nigerian participants, so I'll be interested in your perspectives on that, where the military is very involved in a lot of the illicit activities. They not only have no incentives to sort of stop the fighting, but they become, instead of a protective force, they become a force of insecurity for citizens. And I will go into this a little bit later. If we don't address that piece of that, we may actually enable them to become more of a threat to citizen security than helpful. So I think the short answer was yes, it's a big issue.
I'm going to channel one more participant and ask you a question on which you could both expatiate for hours. And this participant notes that, the discussion is oriented largely around corrupt elites in the global South, but asks, what about linkages, transnational linkages between local and regional actors involved in corruption and allegedly, technically legal, lawful corporations such as Occidental Petroleum, Chiquita, Dole, Coca-Cola, and so on. And that is to say, what is the relationship between local and international actors in corruption?
Diana, do you want to kick off
Yeah,
on this
and I'll
first?
let you talk about the lawful but awful corruption. But certainly, and I think that we're starting to see some more engagement with the issue of how international institutions and systems reinforce the corruption in a lot of these places. So, so with a focus on thinking about how do we shut down the enablers, the bankers, the real estate agents and the real estate markets, the transparency laws in places like the UK, the US, Canada, you name it. A number of these things really enable. One of the reasons that these high levels of corruption are able to happen is because the money goes internationally and is able to go internationally. So the international community broadly and internally really needs to take some responsibility for that and be able to do it because can't make it go away, but certainly can really constrain the opportunities for doing that if there's some action that's taken.
Thank you for that. Let's move then to part 3, which is about peace building and corruption, and we'll hear from Cheyanne.
I'm going to jump in and just do a little bit more response to that, and then we can move on. Thank you, Joel, for your patience with me. The only way corruption benefits individuals in the long term is if the whole global system wasn't making out like a bandit on it. So London, Vancouver, New York real estate. We even in Canada had a corruption scandal of people paying their tuition with bags of cash, and they'd get into 5 or 6 different universities, pay their tuition with bags of cash because there was no rule that said they couldn't, and then they would withdraw from that university within the withdraw period to get their full tuition back. But we don't pay, universities in Canada don't pay tuition back in cash, they wire transfer it. Boom, we now have clean money. And so if Canada, and that's just a tiny example. So if you want to call it the global north, the west, the global minority, whatever, if these economies didn't benefit from them, regardless of what you want to say about anti-money laundering regulations, then it wouldn't make sense to continue these systems. So it is completely transnational. Corrupt individuals in highly fragile and uncertain states, they're no dummies. They want their money out and in places where they can be cleaned and then mobilized in case things go bad at home. And so that's where the banking institutions, real estates, and what Diana was saying really play a role. I'll say one more quick thing. Sorry, Joel, thank you for your patience. Well, it is entirely transnational. It can be regional. A colleague of mine at UNDP was saying, first of all, the money in a conflict bounces next door. It doesn't automatically go to London. It goes to the neighboring countries, and then it starts to move when that gets tightened up. But our typical responses are bilateral from an international aid perspective. So the response has to be bounded by the borders of the country, but the problem does not. And so we're in another form of mismatch between response. And we're responding typically out there, not here at home. So I'm in Canada, so the response is in Yemen or Syria or DRC, the anti-corruption response, much more aggressively than it is here at home in Canada, which is another weakness. Thank you for your patience, Joel. I'm going to hand that back to Diana.
Super. Really rich, substantive responses to that provocative question. Yeah.
Okay, so Joel, you set us up for this next section extremely well, because I think a question is, what are the implications once you know that conflict has really either fueled and created opportunities, expanded sort of corruption in the post-conflict environment? How do you deal with it? And when we think about conflict and corruption, we tend not to think about how peace building policies and practices can exacerbate it. We think about how conflict can exacerbate it. But there is good evidence that it does when it is what we are calling corruption blind, as a sort of takeoff on conflict blind. In other words, it doesn't think about the corrupt patterns and how corruption works in the environment in which it's now being implemented. And I'll give a few examples. We hear about, and there has been a lot of discussion about at least two ways in which this has happened. One is sanctions. I mean, we know, and we've known for a long time, that sanctions tend to have a side effect in that they lead to development of illicit economies by necessity, sanctions busting, various other things to get the money. And I think the challenge is, as Cheyanne has said just now, is that these things don't go away. When the war stops, the rest of the infrastructure remains. And we haven't really come up with good ways of thinking about how to think long-term when we're starting to think about sanctions. The second area that it also has gotten a lot of discussion in the literature, though I think less action in reality, is around post-conflict reconstruction aid. When you introduce large amounts of aid into resource-scarce environments that have weak institutions, limited absorptive capacity, history of endemic corruption, and that are also divided and highly competitive, it's not only distorts the economy, but it provides opportunities, but also incentives for them to grow. And an issue is that donors often don't put in place sufficient oversight, contracting practices, or staff to deal with it, partly because they don't have the resources to do that. But they also often don't have the contextual knowledge either. That part is something that they could do about. So those are things that have been discussed a lot in literature, in the policy circles, in practice, although still having challenges about how to deal with the corruption side effects of those. Less commonly discussed are the corruption impacts of what are good peace-building approaches. In other words, ones that are really intended to address the underlying causes of conflict. And again, if it's corruption blind, it's not to say don't do it, but if it's corruption blind, it may actually make corruption worse. And I'll give just a couple of examples from our and partners' experience. Security sector reform, which is reform of the military, police, et cetera. It's critical to peace building. I mean, security, these are actors that are supposed to be providing security for citizens. And in many cases, these actors have often played significant roles in conflict and in circumstances leading to conflict and generating insecurity and human rights violations. So they're important for reform. What do most of the programs do? Many of the programs that are supporting security sector reforms focus on what they call train and equip, which means they provide equipment, they provide technical training, infrastructure to these institutions. They often don't consider the role of corruption, despite the fact that for example, in Transparency International's and the Corruption Perceptions Index, people have said that and many other indices and perceptions, people think that corruption in police and judiciary especially are some of the worst in their countries. And despite the fact that we know that corruption is a key explanatory variable for low levels of peace, it tends to get ignored. And so there's not as much attention or resources provided to supporting governance reforms in the security sector, whether it's human resources management and financial systems to make them more robust, disciplinary oversight, transparency, civilian oversight, et cetera, to curb some of the corrupt practices that are rampant in these organizations, including the military. So what happens? The equipment and the funds get them, and without dealing with the underlying corrupt dynamics, they allow them to do what they were doing already better. And this is something that we found in our research on corruption in the criminal justice sector in Central African Republic. And Transparency International in Mali looked at security sector reform in the military specifically and found the same thing. Decentralization and power sharing, to just one other example. Also very common elements of peace agreements and very important elements of a sort of restructuring to manage and resolve conflict. But that too, if you don't pay attention to corruption, can have sort of negative effects on corruption that again are then difficult to dislodge. In Kosovo, for example, where it's a place both Cheyanne and I have worked extensively on the peace building end, there's been some good research that was showing that that the decentralization that was part of the peace processes, where they created new municipalities with enhanced competencies, devolving power. And the purpose was good, to protect the rights of the Serb minority in Kosovo by creating Serb majority municipalities so that they could have some control over their own affairs and also induce greater acceptance of Kosovar institutions. So good purpose. It did forestall and sort of put an end to intergroup fighting. And in theory, the decentralization should have helped to improve accountability to citizens by bringing the state closer to citizens. But since there was no attention paid to that accountability dimension in implementing the decentralization plan, and so what happened? It ended up shifting opportunities for rent seeking from sort of the national central level to the regions. So that prompted political parties and national elites to strengthen the vertical patronage systems. And so within 5 years, all the mayors were beholden to the nationalist political parties and did their bidding. Municipal government staffs were basically determined by political party clients and patrons. So again, this helped prevent the resurgence of violence, perhaps, but then undermine the accountability and functioning of the state, which of course continues to have implications and ramifications now for the legitimacy of the state and how its functions and service provision, et cetera, including intergroup relations. So if we know, is there a trade-off between short-term and long-term? So if we know that corruption can be a driver of conflict, and that corruption is an integral aspect of post-conflict environments, and that peace building can potentially, not always, but potentially make it worse. The question that we have been struggling with is, why is it that corruption is so rarely addressed in peace building? To be fair, anti-corruption does appear sometimes explicitly, sometimes more indirectly in peace agreements. There's been a study on that for those who are interested in looking at where that has happened. And so it's not that it's completely ignored, but often when it does appear, sometimes it's just rhetoric, but often it's not followed up on. And in peace building assistance, as a 2022 OECD study, and I think it's not public yet, but the study found, looking at allocation of donor funds, they found that only 6% of donor funds for reconstruction and peace building were allocated to anti-corruption. And at one level, you say 6%, not so bad given all the other things that you need to actually deal with in a post-conflict setting. But if you consider that this 6% includes all assistance to judicial and police reform and to legislative and political party functions, in addition to direct anti-corruption, like anti-corruption commissions, et cetera, it's pretty small. So what's going on? We think a key reason is what we've started to call the short-term, long-term dilemma. Mediators and peace builders worry that corruption is too sensitive to deal with in the immediate aftermath of violent conflict. They try to address corruption, and Joel, I think you said this in your question, it could upset a very delicate and vulnerable peace settlement. So there's a trade-off, unpleasant as it may be, between then ending violence and promoting longer-term good governance. And as we discussed earlier, there's some truth to that. corruption can play a stabilizing role. And so the theory that people have is stabilize now, and then later we'll deal with corruption and good governance. And as you can see here on the slide, there are a number of problems with this logic, we think. And the first one is whether it's really sustainable and effective, whether it's actually true. Having a political settlement that relies a lot on corruption as the glue that holds party together can be highly vulnerable to changes in resources. So in South Sudan, for example, where governance is based on this kind of a system, elite bargains around cabinet posts, around security commands, and crucially, access to oil-linked rents. They hold a coalition together temporarily, but as soon as the resources diminish, let's say there's an oil production cut, which there has been, or prices go down, it has led a number of times to renewed violence. So it's very hard to then move on to achieve a very stable peace. The other piece is that ignoring corruption, yes, the war ends, but it doesn't mean that violence ends. And so it can, the corruption can enable and exacerbate, in fact, shift into other forms of violence that are equally harmful for people's security. Let's say, so the war is over, but violence increases in repression of civil society and media who try to expose corruption. There may be land grabbing, use of armed units by government actors to protect illicit interests, collusion and impunity for organized crime in exchange for benefits. Cheyanne mentioned Guatemala. Some of the things that they were discovering in Guatemala had to do a lot with that. So the violence actually shifted, and it was part of, in fact, the political settlement. And from a citizen's perspective, this is not exactly peaceful. A more general issue, I think, is around the sequencing, that the assumptions that you can sort of ignore corruption and stabilize and then deal with it later. The trouble is, by the time you actually get around to being ready to deal with corruption, in Bosnia, it took many years before anybody turned their attention to and resources to corruption. It's so entrenched that it becomes difficult to deal with. And so as a result, a context gets locked into a negative piece. So you can change the slides, Cheyanne. There's an absence of violence, and even then there are other forms of violence that make people equally insecure. But the prospects for making progress towards a more just and sustainable peace, where the root causes are addressed, where attitudes, institutions, and structures that can sustain peace and address inequalities, justice, etc., just can't happen. They struggle with that. So let me end with a few just thoughts on sort of what about dealing with the challenge, because I'm sure that's the question that's on everybody's mind, including ours. And it's challenging because the tensions and trade-offs are real, but I don't think they're absolute. This is a long-term strategic issue. It needs long-term strategic thinking. And a challenge is that the tools and strategies from both the anti-corruption community and the peace-building community have not to date actually been able to come up with solutions, in part, I think, as Cheyanne said at the very beginning, because the fields are so silent. They haven't provided the solution. So a few directions to think about. Where there are some efforts happening, for example, anti-corruption is integrated into peace agreements. Although it's not clear how much of that is just rhetoric, it does provide a hook or focal point for mobilization of actors who are concerned about these issues, which is not unimportant. Enhancing inclusivity of peacemaking processes when possible, and then supporting post-conflict actors that can bring these issues into the agenda and work with them, also can provide opportunities. A colleague of ours has talked about this as creating doorstep conditions to describe how to go about it. That means you can't do everything at once and often can't really address some of the worst forms of corruption at the beginning. when the situation is so volatile. But you can start to strategize in advance and think about in peacemaking and early post-war context, how to lay the foundations for tackling these issues over time and promoting resilience to corruption and to state capture so they don't become trend. This may be supporting particular actors, supporting alliances across sort of across conflict lines and across sectors that can start to work together to take action. And we can act in areas where we do actually have some control. And we talked a lot about closing off the international enablers, so I won't say very much more about that, but that seems to be an area where there's a lot more that can be done to constrain the environment for corruption in a post-conflict area. So many things, there's not a lot of experience. We don't know how to do this well. But a good place to start is actually to promote more dialogue and cooperation between the peace building and the anti-corruption policymakers and practitioners and researchers. Because I think that good solutions will require input and dialogue and sort of joint planning by both. And I will end there so that we can move to the question and answer, which I see there are lots of questions still coming up, and have a discussion.
Thank you. There are indeed a lot of questions. We have 15 minutes for people to comment on or inquire about everything that has been discussed. Let me start with relaying a question that was emailed to us days before your presentation, presumably based upon the questioner having read your brief, and that is, when political will is absent or actively resistant, do researchers and funders have a responsibility to confront that reality? And if so, how? Rather than designing interventions that quietly accommodate this resistance.
You want to start, Cheyanne? You want me to? Yes, that is a context of endemic corruption are generally contexts in which that political will doesn't exist. And that's an overgeneralization. Our sense and our experience is in a lot of these institutions, there are pockets and there are people who really do want to do their jobs properly and who want to fulfill their responsibilities properly. But there are dynamics and norms within these organizations that make it very hard for them to do that. You may not be able to, and that may be true, you may not be able to confront some of these dynamics head on because you don't want to create resistance that will undermine your effectiveness and potentially exacerbate conflict. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do and that you need to just accommodate it. So you can start to really, and we've done that, we did this with some partners in Congo, start to bring together some of these people, judges, lawyers, civil society actors, academics, people who are those islands of integrity so that they can start acting a little bit more collectively and start gaining some momentum. So there are things that you can do. It'll take longer, potentially, but it doesn't mean that you have to sort of accept what's happening and do nothing and sort of put blinders on.
I'll just add, I think there's different positions on this question. And what I heard in the question is when there's a lack of overarching political will in a country to attack corruption, are people who are working on the issue obligated? Should they directly attack it or go around it? And we hear very often from folks who are implementing programs saying there is no political will, but what we're going to do is plant the seeds so that then when there is a window of opportunity, those seeds, that competency, structures, knowledge, etc., will be there and can be activated. Is there any evidence of that coming together and activating in a window of opportunity? not to my knowledge, but I've never actually done a systematic review of it. But that is the theory. We also have to take into account risk and taking action. You can go after the little fish all you want, but if you go after the real big fish, where there is real wealth and power, it's an exceptional amount of risk. And so everybody needs to have their own understanding of what kind of risk they are willing to take on. And I think what the international community does not do a very good job in recognizing is the difference in real risk to domestic actors versus internationals. Internationals can get on a plane. Domestic actors typically can't. So that's all I want to add, is just to explain that that's often what we hear when people say we are not focusing on corruption right now because we can't. There's no political will, so we're doing these other things. You can draw your own conclusions on the validity of that theory of change.
Here is a question of a historical nature, and that is, how have colonial powers used corruption as a strategy to weaken or co-opt opposition groups and militant actors? And in what ways has this same corruption contributed to long-term instability within these former colonial possessions?
I'll start with it, Diane, if it's okay, maybe from a historic perspective, and then you can pick up. And I think I'm going to use a basis in work we've done in Uganda, where there was a British colony, and it was just so clear as day that the original corrupt government was the British colonial power. And I don't just mean from the perspective of it being colonial. That's a given. But I mean in terms of how they actually ran their governance within the country. And so when independence came about, there had been learned behavior of how governance was handled in terms of nepotism, favoritism, all of those sorts of abuses of power for personal gain enacted by the colonial power. So that was an absolute in the Ugandan context, and from what I understand, although I would happily be corrected, is that was a very standard process in many different colonial structures. So I'll hand that over to Diana from there.
Yeah, and I just add sort of from a general perspective, sort of some of the outside powers. Cheyanne had mentioned that we tend to think, when we think about responses, tend to think within borders and within sectoral kinds of silos. And that's not how these systems work. So in many ways, from the UN to an international NGO to some of these regional and international powers that use corruption, I mean, they are part of that system. And they're doing the same kinds of buying things that others are doing. So I think a first thing would be to really just acknowledge that. And some of what they're doing will have the same kinds of effects that we've talked about already, about exacerbating grievances and purposely trying to do that. So for their own foreign policy and other kinds of needs. But the effects are very similar. And if you understand some of the dynamics, maybe there'll be some opportunities to create some mechanisms or processes for becoming a little bit more resilient to it.
The question is, do you think that endemic corruption can be perpetuated by non-state actors who coerce or threaten governments that are not necessarily corrupt themselves? I have a feeling that the questioner has in mind, possibly the locus classicus of state capture by organized crime groups, and that would be, Mexico, where the drug cartels have, at least until fairly recently, were deeply or I should say very robustly in control of the long dominant PRI party in Mexico. But the question, I guess, sort of presumes that there are people who engage in corruption within government who don't want to, but feel that they have to in order to avoid the consequences of resisting. So I can rephrase the question again, or I should restate it, which is, do you think that endemic corruption can be perpetuated by non-state actors who coerce or threaten governments that are not necessarily corrupt themselves? I mean, I guess they are, if they engage in corruption, whether willingly or unwillingly, it's hard to say that they are not corrupt themselves, but
Yeah, I think it's a dynamic,
Mhm.
and it's a dynamic that happens over time. And I think there's no question that once you get into this dynamic, it's very difficult to get out of it. And that, in that sense, some of these non-state actors um, have attained a certain amount of coercive power that makes it really difficult for anybody to deviate. And so that they can maintain that even if there's a lot of political will to move in another direction. Um, a challenge also earlier, I mean, but at the same time, sort of how they operate maybe it requires some interaction. So there may be some people in the government. Not a whole government isn't necessarily corrupt versus necessarily not corrupt. So there will be people in the government who have stakes and who may be participating with a number of these groups and who benefit, and those who don't. Given the systems and the systems within the government too, and we've seen that in some of the work we've done in Uganda and elsewhere. That if you deviate in the government and try to do your job, your superior who may be engaged and involved in embedded in some of these things will post you to the worst place possible. You will be exposed. So it's very difficult for individuals to do that. Ways to figure out some collective action need to be happening, because I think it's true that once it gets into that dynamic, yeah, the non-state, so criminal groups have the upper hand in that sense. They're able to maintain it.
Cheyanne, anything to add?
Nothing that's particularly unique, so I'm happy for us to move on.
I wonder if when you are working in countries on the problem of corruption and conflict, if you have found yourselves in situations where you've felt personally threatened by those who stand to lose by efforts to control or eliminate corruption.
Generally speaking, no, because the way in which we go about trying to research on corruption and conflict is not like an investigation where we're trying to figure out who did what, when, and for how much. We're trying to understand the dynamics that are allowing it to happen. That horribly messy map that I showed you, we're trying to understand what the why it is happening, what enables it to happen, and how do those relationships work, how do those factors relate to each other. Because with that understanding, we posit that then you can come up with a more integrated response. So we're very careful to make it really clear from the first moment of contact in terms of a qualitative data collection that this is not an investigation. We'll, in highly sensitive places, we'll go so far as to say, don't tell us any names, don't give us any concrete identifiers. We don't really want to know the particular individual. We want to know if it was a role or a function. There have been veiled things, and it's kind of directly proportionate to how close you get to the individual and how insecure. So doing the research in Central African Republic in Bangui, well, the militias were coming in. That was pretty fraught, and we were kicked out of some offices by angry local officials who were angry that we would even consider talking about it. What I will just add on that, though, is there is a general incorrect assessment amongst the West that talking about corruption is taboo. Not amongst the average citizen who's between a rock and a hard place and is just trying to navigate basic services. They want a vaccine for their kid, they want access to a school, etc. Those folks are typically very happy to talk and explain what's happening because it is an absolute friction in their life, even when they know sometimes they benefit from it, meaning they make something go faster or they get an undue benefit. They're very aware of the friction in their life. The abusers of power for personal gain might, however, they are much harder to get to speak to, and we have to do much more relationship building and figuring out common and trusted interlocutors to introduce us, and sometimes us not being involved. Sometimes we're the best people to be involved. Sometimes we're the worst people to be involved. And that comes down to race, gender, nationality, all of those things we have to take into account when we're thinking about will we help or hinder people talking to us. But definitely harder to get folks who are in positions of entrusted authority. But we have figured out tactics, just like similar qualitative research tactics as if researching domestic violence, sexually transmitted diseases, some of those sensitive topics to get around things. Diana?
I just add that what we really try to do is not moralize corruption. And sort of say these are the bad guys and these are the good guys. And not to say that there aren't greedy bad guys, because there are. But many people are feeling like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, or they have competing obligations. And so I think as people kind of see that we're not coming in to kind of say, oh, point our finger at them, but say, look, we really want to understand how the system works, because it put everybody in a difficult position, not because you're bad or unethical or et cetera. Sometimes it takes a while of relationship building because it's not the usual way people come in and research corruption. But when that happens, it becomes easier for people to open up.
Sure. That is a sound approach, it seems to me. And the question I pose to you is one that could be asked of many of the scholars whose research we at the foundation support, given the focus of the foundation's work, which is violence. Well, this has been a fabulous discussion, unsurprisingly, and we are very grateful to our speakers, Diana and Cheyanne, and to our audience participants as well. I want to remind those who've tuned in to download the Research and Policy in Brief that Diana and Cheyanne authored. And I'll remind you as well that the recording of today's presentation will shortly be available on our website and our YouTube channel. And please let anyone who wasn't able to attend or didn't know about this event, but who might be interested, let them know about these resources. And please keep an eye out for the announcement of the next event in our Knowledge Against Violence series. Thanks again to all, and bye.
Thanks, everybody.